So to give a quick note of context for our guest this morning, in addition to, or as part of my pastoral assignment here, I'm also now serving as an adjunct professor at a nearby university. And earlier this week, we began studying Judaism in my world religions class. Now, between the ongoing trials and tribulations in the Near East, the memory of student protests close at home, and my own deep interfaith commitments, I was a little nervous about how it would turn out. It also happens to be the first time we're looking at one of our own religions, as some of my students come from Jewish backgrounds, and so it's not simply a matter of talking about what people somewhere else in the world think or believe. It was something a little more close to home. So there was a unique anxiety at work this past week as I set about lesson planning. I've got to frame this in just the right way. I have to make these points, but I need to couch them softly. I've got to be prepared to respond to these sorts of questions or concerns or frustrations. And as I worked through the material, I decided to present to my students an overarching theme for our study. The phrase, giving back to abundance. I won't go into depth on it now, but it serves to represent a persistent and cyclical theme in the history of the Hebrew people. Having established a series of covenants with God from Adam and Eve to Noah to Abraham and finally Moses, the people experienced temporary success and respite before falling into indolence and idolatry. And as a result, they were repeatedly removed from the fertile lands they had been promised by famine or invasion, finding themselves transported into exile in Egypt or Assyria or Babylon, or finally Roman occupation that finally led them to be scattered throughout the world as an existentially homeless people. Throughout it all, in one way or another, the foundational question persisted. How do we get back to abundance? And there have been different answers throughout time and geographical location. The prophets preached that the covenant must be renewed and honored so that God would look again with favor upon his people. Others believed that salvation might come through military might, either by means of conquest or rebellion, depending on the circumstance. Some modern rabbinic traditions have reinterpreted what abundance means altogether under conditions of diaspora in such a way that we might experience abundant life anywhere in the world. While others still understand that the lands of Israel must be inextricably linked to fulfillment of this lofty goal. Somehow we must get back to Israel in order to have abundance. What does your abundant life look like? I asked my students, my 18-year-old students. One spoke of being with her large family, together, enjoying one another without fighting, no conflict. That was her vision of an abundant life. Another mentioned good food and hanging out with friends. That was their vision of an abundant life. Finally, one simply said, money. How much money? I asked. And her answer was, I don't know, just a lot. I know if I asked you the same question, what does your abundant life look like? It would be different. I would get health, my grandchildren, peace, lower property taxes. But I shared all of this and more with my friend Rabbi Reeser on Friday. And he, thank God, liked and affirmed this theological and sociological framing. How do we get back to abundance? I would have hated to disappoint a dear friend by mischaracterizing his religion. And as we continue to speak about our shared scriptures and of this story and history of covenant after covenant, it eventually brought us back to my faith, to our faith, to Christianity, because it is precisely this history and tradition of broken covenants that set the stage for the intervention of Jesus of Nazareth, who we proclaim to be the Messiah, the Son of the living God. It's precisely because of this covenantal story in which we humans, the descendants of Abraham, be you Hebrew or not, we just seem incapable of actually adhering to the terms of our divine oaths and contracts, to our holy covenants. And so in Jesus, God found a way to take responsibility for our side of the agreement, our half of the contract, to uphold our end of the bargain for us, since we have demonstrated our persistent inability to keep it ourselves. And that's what we mean when we say that the law, which was meant for good, for our flourishing, for our abundance, had become a curse. Because since we simply couldn't obey it, the law became something that could only judge us, only find us wanting, and finally sentence us ultimately to death. So it is that we Christians look to someone else to fulfill the law on our behalf, the one who will break the cycle of covenantal agreement, human failure and abandonment, and the resulting divine judgment. And this is who we claim and understand Jesus to be, the Son of God who took on human flesh, who, though perfect and sinless, also took upon himself responsibility for all human failing, who was mocked and executed as the King of the Jews, as the sign above his head read on the cross. And he was killed in such a ruthless manner that it could be said that justice for our crimes had been achieved. The death that we deserved was taken on by the very person who least deserved it. And yet, even then, Jesus overcame even death, rising from the grave after 3 days, ascending to be with God the Father, where he continues to intercede on behalf of humanity in the midst of our never-ending weakness. It sounds like the creed, because that's the creed. The creeds are the response and fulfillment of this millennia's-long story of broken covenants. This is why we say that in Jesus the covenant has been fulfilled and a new covenant has been established between humanity and our God, one in which, by grace alone, Jesus has taken responsibility for our side of the arrangement. That is the pivotal moment that we rehearse every month in the sacrament of communion, as we observe and lift up the cup to declare that this is Christ's blood of the new covenant, poured out for us, poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. In his death and resurrection, we have been freed from the chains of a law that could only harm us, and have been released into a new covenant in which our relationship with God is the one that brings salvation. But as Daniel, Rabbi Reeser, was quick to point out, that doesn't mean that we can simply do whatever we want, right? Even as the Apostle Paul recognized that this new covenant has fundamentally changed the game, even as it opened the doors of divine grace to the inclusion of Gentiles and rendered certain cultural practices irrelevant to non-Jewish peoples. If anything, the new covenant turns the heat up on ethics. It It takes the already high standard of the Hebrew Bible and cranks those dials to 11. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. No excuses. The law has been completed, not done away with. As Jesus announced in the very beginning of the Gospels in Matthew, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill, to complete, to bring to fruition and fulfillment. And in fulfilling the law and completing the terms of the agreement on our behalf, the consequences have changed, but so have our motivations for obeying and observing the law itself. We no longer adhere to the law out of a sense of obligation, or fear of reprisal, or because we're seeking divine favor. You've already got it. Rather, we look to the law with joy. We receive the scriptures with gratitude as a guide to achieving, to experiencing, to receiving our own truly abundant life. A life that is filled with holy purpose, deep meaning, and rich fellowship with God and with one another. It's that different orientation toward the law that we hear in that song from earlier in our worship. Oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all day long. Your commandment makes me wiser than my enemies, for it is always with me. I have more understanding than all my teachers, for I keep your precepts. I do not turn away from your ordinances, for you have taught me. How sweet are your words to my taste, sweeter than honey to my mouth. Oh, how I love your law. These are the words of someone who has come to understand that the ways of our God are fundamentally good and good for us, giving rise to abundance in every aspect of our lives, wherever God may take us. And it brings me back to last week's story about the lepers, and that question about whether it's better to be clean or well. To simply be released from the ravages of the law, simply be freed from the way that it used to exclude and punish us, or to be transformed into one who loves the lawgiver. That too may be the meaning behind the parable we just heard from the Gospel of Luke, which tells the story of a woman who finds justice through persistence, and yet it ends with this ominous question. And will not God bring justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Yes. Will he delay long in helping them? No. I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Will he find faith on earth? The implication here seems to be a contrast, again, between those who simply seek God's favor transactionally versus those who seek God himself relationally, like those lepers who got their blessing and then carried on as if nothing had happened. They ran back to their lives. They ran back to their families, to their work. They just went back to the day-to-day grind. But there was one who returned, running back to Jesus to worship at his feet. He was the one for whom the experience of God's grace led to a transformational moment in which he became a worshiper, a devotion, one who is a devotee. He came back and pursued Jesus himself and not simply his healing. The persistent widow in our parable this morning didn't just want a favorable ruling. She wanted justice. She wanted relationships restored. She wanted to live abundantly in community again. And when Jesus asks whether he will find faith on earth, he's asking whether we will be people who merely petition God for blessings, or whether we will be people who persistently seek God himself. That's the difference between asking, how do I get back to abundance, as if it were a destination to reach, and understanding that abundance instead comes from walking faithfully with the one who has already fulfilled every requirement, who has completed and fulfilled the law, who intercedes for us even now, and who invites us into relationship day by day, night by night, prayer by prayer. So this morning, like the psalmist, may we find God's ways and words sweeter than honey, not because they earn us favor, but because they draw us closer to the one who has already secured our place at the table. May it be so.